This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com. A little more introduction to my background. I'm actually fourth generation Ocean Parkway, although my grandparents are from Queens, so I guess that counts for something. I'm what's known as FFA, you know, there's FFB and BT, Balchuk. I'm from Aish. I actually was raised pretty secular in New Rochelle, New York, and my kids asked what that meant, and they said, I tell them on Passover we used to have ham and cheese on matzah, and I'm not kidding, sadly. My son asked, why'd you bother? And I said, it was Passover, we're not allowed to have any bread. Anyway, I went to public school. I went to undergrad. I went to Vassar College. I was a Russian major, and I studied Japanese. And when I graduated, I took a year off because I wanted to get fluent in my Russian and take a year off. So I decided to go as a graduate student to the University of Moscow. You know, you could learn a language in classroom for years, but if you want to speak it, you got to go live there. I always say if you want to learn Spanish, you got to live in Florida. So my plan was to go half a year as a graduate student to the University of Moscow and then to go to kibbutz and pick grapefruits for 3 months and then go to NYU. When I went off to Russia during the bad old days of communism, which at least you guys remember that, my 19-year-old students in Israel don't know what that is, it was illegal for a Jew to even own a book in Hebrew. And I ended up basically, I was so impressed with all these young Russian Jews who were risking their lives literally to learn a little bit of Judaism and some Hebrew. I said, there's got to be more to Judaism than I've been exposed to. Maybe I'll do something a little more meaningful than just go pick grapefruits on kibbutz. So I checked into Aish Torah for a 3-month stay, which has now turned into 3 months and 31 years. Time flies when you're having fun. And as you heard the rest, I spend most of my time in Israel teaching, guiding, and writing, including guiding on the JWRP groups, the women's groups. I've been working on them from the very beginning. By the way, it's an unbelievable program. Of all the kiruv I do, I have to say it's the biggest bang for the buck that I've ever seen, watching groups of women just totally change. The rest of the time, when I'm not in Israel, I'm on exotic speaking tours to places like Queens, which is why I married a travel agent. My wife is from London. She speaks very proper English and tells me I don't speak English at all. And I have 5 kids and live in Givat Ze'ev, right outside Jerusalem. Okay, with that introduction, Gold, who I want to thank for organizing all of this, specifically, a lot of phone calls and emails. And in the end, I even had the wrong date. I thought I was coming last week. Thank God I called her beforehand. It would have been a really impactful event, me standing in an empty shul. Thank God this night was also open, so it worked out fine. Everything's beshert. But Golda specifically asked, what can we do pre-Shavuos? So while my general thing is not to talk about holidays, everything I talk about can be tied into various aspects of Judaism and the Jewish cycle. And this particular subject, let me just remove the lens cover. Sorry. Forgot about that. Yes. Albert Einstein. Probably couldn't even drive. But by the way, start out with a trivia question. If you want to use his name, not his picture, but who do you have to ask for permission? Anyone know? Hebrew University. Very good. You get an A. They didn't get his brain, but they got his name. But this particular topic, I think, is very fitting for us to look at because it has to deal with the power of the Jewish people and how to direct the incredible drive and creativity of the Jewish people. So I think it's a great pre-Shavuos topic. And it also comes from my own personal experience, having been raised secular, but culturally very Jewish. And it's interesting, when I was little, I lived in a part of New Rochelle, New York, which was so Jewish. My elementary school was like 90% Jewish. We used to call it Jew Rochelle. Yeah. But when I got to junior high school, my friends got a little more, ethnically diverse. My best friend in junior high school was David Nakagawa. He was Japanese, And my best friend in college was John Frenzel, who was the son of a Lutheran minister who had 3 sisters named Faith, Hope, and Charity. I kid you not. Who never met a Jew in his life and ended up rooming with 3 of them in college. I think he's still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder from living with 3 Jews for a year. But anyway, my big question was, and I noticed that, Jews, my parents were not religious at all, but culturally very Jewish. All their friends were Jewish. And as I hung out with non-Jews, I noticed people had different energy. And the first question I asked Rabbi Noach Weinberg, of blessed memory, my Rosh Hashiva, and the founder of Aish Torah, was, are Jews different? So let me ask you guys, this is really not a great audience because you guys are background, so you'll probably give me a slightly skewered answer. But who thinks Jews are different from non-Jews? Raise your hand. Okay, it's like the usual response, you get about 60%. I'm not the only one to ask this. A lot of famous people have asked this. For instance, Ernst van den Haag. He didn't invent the ice cream. He's actually a sociologist, Dutch-American sociologist. Can you guys see the quotes? Is the light too bright? Can you read them? Okay, he says, asked to make a list of the men who have most dominated the thinking of the modern world, many educated people would name Freud, Einstein, Marx, and Darwin. Of these four, excuse me, only Darwin was not Jewish. In a world where Jews are only a tiny percentage of the population, what is the secret of the disproportionate importance the Jews have had in the history of Western culture? A rabbi once said of the four most impactful thinkers, 3 were Jewish, 1 was wrong. Not actually right either. I'm sorry, Marx was wrong. Freud, I don't think he was. Einstein's holding up pretty well. But what's being pointed out here? The Jews seem to be disproportionately impactful in the realm of ideas for sure. This wasn't the question I was asking Rabbi Weinberg. I was just, are Jews different? And it's a question that once, when I asked Rabbi Weinberg, and if anyone's ever heard him, he's now unfortunately no longer with us, but Rabbi Weinberg had a genius for saying very profound things in a very simple way that you only usually appreciated like 10 years later when you thought about him. But the answer he gave me, I want to hold off on because I want to take this a little further and ask you guys a question. Assuming Jews are different, is the essential difference nature or nurture? Do you guys know the great debate in psychology? Like, we are who we are because of our environment, or it's in like our programming, we're born that way. And obviously, before you vote, obviously nurture is going to play a role, because if you travel around the world and look at Jews from different parts of the world, even if Jews are all the same, English Jews are different from American Jews, and California Jews are different from New York Jews. I heard a funny joke that illustrates this point about how culture plays an impact on strengths of a society. It goes like this. In the best of all possible worlds, the soldiers are British, the cooks are French, the romantics are Italian, and the engineers are German. And in the worst of all possible worlds, the cooks are British, the soldiers are French, the romantics are German, and the engineers are Italian. Like, no one ever went to England for the food. You know, like French Military Victories is like the shortest book in the world. Fiat might stand for Fix It Again, Tony, you know. So we appreciate that different cultures have different strengths. It's something that they seem to pick up from the air. But let me ask you guys, assuming Jews are different, who thinks the difference is intrinsic in who the Jewish people are? It's interesting that the vote always goes down to less than half, because this makes people nervous. It's interesting, even though this is largely a frum crowd. Like, does that mean better? Is this like racist? You know, like Hitler thought the Germans were superior. I'm not saying better, by the way. I'm just saying different. So I want to get to that answer in a minute. But what Rabbi Weinberg said was something quite different. Well, he went on to explain, before we look at his answer, like, how did the difference manifest itself? When we look at Jews, to understand what sets us apart, the number one thing we see is, first of all, drive. Jews are disproportionately impactful people. And this is what Rabbi Weinberg said to me. He said Jews are driven. Non-Jews can also be driven, but Jews are disproportionately driven. And this is demonstrated by the ridiculously over-the-top impact the Jewish people have had in the world. Statistically, there's so many examples that illustrate that despite our teeny size, we always seem to make this huge impact on the world. Mark Twain, whose real name is Samuel Clemens, who has 7 patents for, this is the trick question, suspenders. You know that Mark Twain invented suspenders? Now you know. If you ever win that on a game show, you got to give me 10%. But what does Mark Twain say? If statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. Today it's 0.2%. It suggests a nebulous puff of smoke lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in science, in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world in all ages, and has done it with his hands tied behind him. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? And he's pointing out 2 really interesting things. Number one is the disproportionate impact of the Jewish people, given their teeny size, and the fact that we seem to survive despite all the odds. But he's still asking the question, like, what accounts for this disproportionate Jewish impact? And by the way, you see this everywhere. It's not just a phenomenon that Mark Twain may have noticed in America. If Jews are truly different in some intrinsic way, we'd expect this to constantly show itself regardless of what culture we find ourselves in. Today, by the way, Jews are all of 2% of the world's population, 0.2%, excuse me, whether we were 2%. We're 0.2% of the world's population and 1.7% of the population of the United States. What's the Jewish population in New York, by the way? Anyone know? It's about 10%. Over here in Queens, it's about 60%. Yet, look at Jews, despite 1.7%, 10% of the student body in university. Ivy League schools, it's, by the way, 25 to 35%. Like Harvard Law School, Dershowitz on down, 40% Jewish, tenured professors. 22% of the Nobel Prize winners? I mean, think about that. If we're 0.2% of the population, how many Nobel Prizes do the Jewish people have? Like 0.2%. Yet this, by the way, is quite old. This is already maybe 5, 6 years old. The number is close to 180 now, I believe, or over 180. Look what it says here. At least 170 Jews and persons of half Jewish ancestry have been awarded the Nobel Prize, accounting for 22% of all individual recipients worldwide. If you can see this list as it's going by, it's quite ridiculous. In economics, it's like 40% of the Nobel Prizes in economics. And so on, physics. It's an incredibly disproportionate number. And it's indicating there's something really unusual about the Jewish people, that the most prestigious prize that could be won in the world, that 23 to 24% of the winners are Jewish, when we're 0.2% of the population. By the way, the Fields Medal in mathematics, you guys heard of that? Jews are also like 22% of Fields Medal winners, and so on. And obviously, it's not just the Nobel Prize, it's not just America. Again, if this drive is something intrinsic in the Jewish people, we'd expect to see it at all times. And in fact, if you go to Germany before the Nuremberg laws, you guys remember 1935 when Hitler threw the Jews out of universities, robbed us of our bank accounts and a right to vote? Look at the statistics here. Jews, by the way, are 0.6% of the population of Germany, a third of what they are in America today, yet 16% of the lawyers, 10% of the doctors and dentists, 70% of the bankers, 11% of real estate, 25% of retail business, 70% of department stores. Remember that joke, why did God create Gentiles? Someone had to buy retail? Like all the Jews are doing the wholesale here. This is a ridiculous number. And it's not just in America, and it's not just in Germany. Wherever we look in history, we see that even in medieval Europe, where the entire world's Jewish population was probably less than 1 million people, Jews were the middlemen of everything in trade, finance, diplomacy, knowledge. We were like the little powerhouse spurring on intellectual and academic and economic growth in Europe. Like my family, for instance, is from the city of Spiro in Germany. The Bishop Rustiger Hosmann of Spire in 1084, he writes, "Wishing to make Spire into a city, I thought to increase its honor 1,000-fold by bringing in the Jews." You think the Bishop of Spire liked Jews? No. But he recognized that medieval Europe, which was in many ways stagnant, and Jews were such a dynamic force, having a couple hundred Jews in your town would so change the dynamic in the economy of the town that you could build a bigger city and even build a cathedral. The problem was, of course, if you fast forward 400 years later, the Jews in Speyer are expelled twice in 1 century. The Jews in Mainz are expelled 5 times 400 years later in 1 century. Can you imagine leaving a city 5 times? Like by the second time they were saying, you know what? We're not even unpacking the suitcases, and we're definitely not buying property here. Which brings me to another very interesting point, which we're going to look at in a minute. But Will Durant, the famous historian, sums up this incredible Jewish impact by writing, "So prominent was the Jewish role in foreign commerce of Europe that those nations that received the Jews gained, and the countries that excluded them lost in the volume of international trade." And it's more than just trade, by the way. You can literally chart the rise and fall of civilizations and empires by how they treat their Jews. And by the way, the countries that were often the best to us ended up being the worst to us. Are you guys aware of that? It's an interesting sort of supernatural aspect of Jewish history, that the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism have generally taken place in places where we're the most comfortable. But this goes back to an interesting idea which goes all the way back to Bereshit. In Genesis, God says to Abraham, "I'll bless those who bless. I will make your name great, and I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." I'm actually, by the way, creating a presentation now. Please God, I'll come back in the future and do it for you, which is called "I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you." The whole purpose of the presentation is just to show how you treat the Jews will impact how your country does. I think it's a good idea to get out there to the world. I think we should probably show it at the opening of the General Assembly next year. Maybe I'll send Ahmadinejad a DVD. No, it's a very fascinating topic. By the way, totally not this topic, but this quote here is the #1 reason why the pro-Israel evangelical community supports Jewish people in Israel. They truly believe that they're going to be treated by God according to how they treat us, which is pretty amazing. At least they take the Bible seriously. Thomas Newton, and this is a wonderful quote, who is the Bishop of Bristol, it's over the 18th century. He says, the preservation of the Jews is really one of the most single and illustrious acts of divine providence. And what but a supernatural power could have preserved them in such a manner as none other nation upon earth hath been preserved? Nor is the providence of God less remarkable in the destruction of their enemies than in their preservation. You get what he's saying in fancy English? You know, their survival is great, and what's even more amazing is the downfall of the people who try and persecute us. We see that the great empires, which in turn subdued and oppressed the people of God, are all come to ruin. And if such hath been the fateful end, the enemies and oppressors of the Jews, let it serve as a warning to all those who at any time or upon any occasion are for raising a clamor and persecution against them. Maybe we could have inscribed this at the entrance to the UN General, whatever. Okay, but this is an interesting side point about how we impact the world and how the rise and fall of civilizations goes according to how people treat us. But we have to go back to our original discussion. Okay, Jews seem to be disproportionately impactful no matter what environment we're in. We always manage to impact the world no matter how few of us there are. But what's the cause of it? Have you guys heard of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who was often accused of being an anti-Semite? He didn't like Christianity very much, but I personally don't believe he had anything against Jews. But look what he says. It's a very profound comment. He says, the Jews, however, are beyond all doubt the strongest, toughest, and purest race at present living in Europe. They know how to succeed even under the worst conditions, in fact, better than under favorable ones. By means of virtues of some sort. I deliberately put that in red because this is what I want to focus on. Which one would like nowadays to label as vices, owing above all to the resolute faith which does not need to be ashamed before the modern ideas. The resourcefulness of the modern Jews, both in mind and soul, is extraordinary. And it's pointing out another unique thing about us. Most cultures that get stressed out by persecution go into a regressive mode. Like a good example is the African American community, which till today has never really recovered from slavery. Yet we Jews not only recover remarkably rapidly, but we're often most productive at periods of time that are most destructive to us. Like, when did Rashi live? During the First Crusade, which was like the worst time in Europe. And since the destruction of the Second Temple and the Bar Kokhba revolt, there was nothing worse than that for Jews. And a tremendous amount of Jewish scholarship, both in Torah and secular science, was coming out of that period of time. But the question I want to focus on, for some reason the white's not supposed to see this yet, but the question I want to focus on is, assuming Jews are different, what accounts for the difference? So many experts speculate on why Jews are disproportionately impactful, and they give a number of different answers. The Jewish focus on education. For those of you who've seen me do my presentation, World Perfect, or read my book, we talk about how Jews are history's only consistently literate nation. 2 is anti-Semitism, the notion that because of the difficult situation, it toughened us up. 3 is sort of a version of the anti-Semitic. It's like the evolutionary thing. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Because we put through such difficult situation, we have evolved into, this incredible super race of people. By the way, a PhD years ago came out with this whole paper saying the ultimate evolutionary form of Homo sapiens sapien is the Ashkenazic Jewish man. Can you imagine a picture of Bernie Schwartz, 5'8", accountant? It's funny though, it's a serious paper. The other explanation is unique destiny. We believed in our fate, and therefore that accounted. We made it be so to speak. The other is close community. Even though we've been scattered around the world, we always use our connections as Jews around the world to, capitalize on different opportunities. And last is, of course, the most important, Jewish mothers. By the way, I always say, besides God, the greatest force in Jewish history is Jewish mothers, for sure. Until I get my PhD, my mother's never going to leave me alone. She's always saying, I want Rabbi Doctor. Thank God my older brother is a doctor, otherwise the pressure would be unbearable. The problem with all of these is none of these begin to explain, a lot of them are just nonsense, and none of them begin to explain really what Jewish Drive is about. As for the focus on education, Jews are not the highest scorers on standardized tests in America today. Who are? Hindus. Indians. Yeah, Hindus are the highest scorers. The anti-Semitism thing is also really weird because it's like taking the rule and using it as the exception. Because like I said, when people are persecuted, and we're persecuted worse than anyone else, they don't become productive. So you cannot use the exception of the Jews being productive as a rule to explain it. The evolutionary thing, there's something to the notion of education or intelligence being inherited. It's a very complex study in genetics, all kind of interesting topic. But by the way, the education doesn't explain things alone, because we're also talking about impact. And just because a person's smart doesn't mean he's going to be disproportionately impactful. Some very smart people don't accomplish very much in this world. Unique destiny, it's great, but just because you believe, every nation and empire believed they had a unique destiny. And the problem with believing it's going to be, it assumes that you control your fate. We've always been everyone else's. We've been in the hands of every other people in the world, not able to actualize our potential. So the notion that just because we believed it is going to explain it doesn't begin to do it. Close-knit community, there's definitely some truth to that. But again, you see like Koreans tend to monopolize like dry cleaning businesses and things like that. But you don't find any parallel to the Jewish people. Whatever you put us into, rising to the top, no matter what skill set, any situation. And last but not least, Jewish mothers are definitely a factor, but even, I hate to even say it, Jews who don't have a good relationship with their mother still seem to be impactful. Rahman al-Atzlan, lo aleinu. So the point is while there's something to some of these, none of these begin to explain the ridiculously disproportionate impact we have. So we're still left with this question, how do we explain the Jewish drive? And the last person I'm going to look at before we go into the Torah answer is, I love this quote. It's Nikolai Berdyaev. And if you can read what it says on the bottom, the candles are kind of Russian philosopher. And he was one of the chief philosophical historians of Stalinist Russia. Remember what the Russians and communism thought about religion. So I find this quote coming from him to be particularly powerful. And he says, the Jews have played an all-important role in history. Their destiny is too imbued with the metaphysical to be explained either in material or positive historical terms. Its survival is a mysterious and wonderful phenomenon, demonstrating that the life of this people is governed by special predetermination, transcending the process of adaptation. Fancy language for saying, I have no idea how the Jewish people are still in this world. The survival of the Jews, their resistance to destruction, their endurance under absolute peculiar conditions, and the fateful role played by them in history all point to the particular and mysterious foundations of their destiny. It's an amazing quote coming out of like this hyper-rational, anti-religious Stalinist Russia. I think it's a fantastic quote. But this is what I really want to focus on. He is totally mystified by the Jewish people's survival and by the disproportionate impact we always play in the world. So what's the answer? Now, we all took biology, and we know that children inherit from their parents genetic material, DNA, chromosomes. No one debates that. You can see it in a microscope. And we know that that's how it works. There's the physical DNA. A baby is literally the product of what the parents contribute on a genetic level, although my wife says it's not fair. The women do all the work and the kid looks like the father anyway. But Judaism also believes in a concept of spiritual DNA. And this is the point we have to focus on. And we have this idea that not only do we get from our parents biological stuff we can see in a microscope, but we get metaphysical spiritual traits. And since we Jews are basically from one family, Abraham and Sarah, our grandparents, that all of us inherit not only genetic traits, even though a lot of people have opted out, sadly, of the Jewish people, and many people have joined, the core of the Jewish people remains essentially genetically and certainly metaphysically connected to Abraham and Sarah. By the way, this is even borne out by genetic studies. Not that Judaism is a racial thing. Have any of you ever heard about the Cohen gene study? You've all heard about it? Just very interesting, not a side point, but fascinating. Kohanim are claiming they're descended from Aaron. That's Moses' brother going back like 135 generations. Like how many of us know 10 generations back, like the names of our great-great-great-grandparents? It's pretty unusual. Yet men have a Y chromosome, and Kohanim go from the man's side, as we know. And then about 25 years ago, they started with early genetic testing. They tested 2,000 Ashkenazic and Sephardic Kohanim, and they found that 75 to 80% of them have a marker on their Y chromosome, which shows that they're all related to one male ancestor over 3,000 years ago, which is very cool. Then they did it to all Jews around the world, and they found that all Jewish populations around the world are more closely related to each other, with the exception of Ethiopians, than the people amongst whom we lived, even though, Jacob Mizrahi, Moroccan Jew, whose skin, hair, and eye color might be very different from ours. On a genetic level, we're all closely related. That our genetic origins of all Jewish communities is Middle Eastern, and that our closest relatives genetically are, anyone know? It's interesting. Who are our closest genetic relatives? Not spiritual. Palestinian Arabs and Kurds, which proves A, we're Middle Eastern, and B, you don't get to pick your relatives. But anyway. But going back to my topic, that's an interesting side thing. If you want to read on it, there's a great book called DNA in the Bible or DNA in Tradition by Yaakov Kleiman. There's a Cohen with 9 boys. He's got his own Mishmeret Kahuna. You can read the book. It's fascinating. But back to our topic. We have this idea of spiritual genetics, that Abraham and Sarah, or any people, all the original nations that inhabited the earth, started out as 2 people having children. Those children not only inherit the physical characteristics, they inherit the spiritual characteristics. Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, who lived in the early 18th century, who wrote Mesilat Yesharim, Derech Hashem, he writes in Derech Hashem, the descendants of each of these individuals, the 70 original nations, were thus divided into permanent groupings, each with its own characteristics and limitations. They were destined to father future generations who would inherit these characteristics, just as members of any particular species inherit the characteristics of their forebears. He's just giving like a spiritual description of what we know to be a biological thing also. There's physical genetics, there's spiritual genetics. The problem is of the 70 original nations, how many are around today? None. There's like none. We're not one of the original. We're a few generations later. But if you could beam yourself back like thousands of years ago, you'd bump into one of these guys in the street and you'd go like, oh, what a Canaanite. It's such a Yavusi thing to do, that kind of stuff. But we Jews, although we are not like one of the original nations, we are one of the oldest surviving nations on the planet Earth. To find people around as long as we are, you have to go to like a museum. Seriously, look in the Torah, look in history books, like where are these Hyksos, Phoenicians, Mycenaeans? They're all gone. I was telling someone a joke. We just at La Bella had some sushi, and I was discussing the Jewish obsession with Asian cooking, which is like a PhD thesis someone has to write. It's funny, even secular Jews think thou shalt have Chinese food on Sunday is one of the 613. But to illustrate this point, there's a joke about a Chinese guy talking to a Jewish guy, and the Chinese guy says to the Jewish guy, Chinese civilization, 3,000 years old, 3,000 years old. And the Jewish guy says, yeah, but Jewish civilization, 4,000 years old. And the Chinese guy says, that's impossible. Where you people eat for first 1,000 years. So we are an ancient people. Our genetic and our physical genetic material, our spiritual origins go back to Abraham and Sarah. And therefore, if my theory is correct, what Ramchal is saying, then we are all a mini personification of the personality traits of Avram Avinu and Sarah. And if we look at them, we understand who we are. So what does the Bible say in Bereshit that says, for I have known him, Abraham, because he will command his children and his household after him to keep God's ways, doing charity and justice. So that's like the first description we get of Abraham, why God goes for him. But what's the trait that embodies what Abraham is all about? Okay, we say Jews are Rahmanim, Baishanim, Gomle Hasidim. These are all aspects of being Jewish. But there is one overarching trait. Think about it. The real greatness of Abraham, as I always say, is in a world that has totally lost connection with God and is all into polytheism and avodah zarah, to come up with this idea of an infinite being, which is so counterintuitive and so think outside the box, is one thing. But to be able to live with it, to tell the whole world, I don't care what you think, I'm willing to live and if necessary to die for the reality of God. What trait does that require? I mean, Abraham's mission was basically tikkun olam on a spiritual level, to bring the world back to connection to God. But to do that, and when you ask non-Jews to describe Jews, they even have a movie we made in Toronto like 30 years ago, interviewing non-Jews. Just came from Toronto today. And they give all these different adjectives. What's the number one word? Comes back to the drive again. This is the trait. Abraham is a person who is driven for absolute meaning and doesn't care what anyone thinks. He wants truth regardless of consequences. We say this trait is passed on, and every Jew has within him or her until today this incredible spiritual drive. I have this book called What Did They Think of the Jews? It's a really interesting book. Like everyone who ever said anything about us, some of them like us, some of them don't, but they all see the same traits in the Jewish people. For instance, this is Goethe. Don't pronounce his name Goethe. People would think you're not well educated. But what does Goethe, the famous German writer, say? Energy is the basis of everything. Every Jew, no matter how insignificant, is engaged in some decisive and immediate pursuit of a goal. It is the most perpetual people of the earth. Like that should be our official motto. We should have like a t-shirt that says that. Most perpetual people of the earth. Has everyone here been to Israel? I love doing this class in Israel because in Israel it's the laboratory. You can sort of get a taste of it in Queens and Brooklyn. But Israel's much better. I always tell people, you want to see Jewish energy in action, the Jewish personality, go to Israel. I say, notice in Israel the horn and the gas pedal seem to be connected. Notice that the colors on a traffic light are red, honk, green. Notice that all traffic regulations and most rules in Israel seem to be merely suggestions. Notice that like please and excuse me and thank you are only used in a dictionary and in a Hebrew ulpan. But are never actually used in spoken Hebrew. I say this for years, but a couple of years ago we married off one of my daughters, and my English wife and I, you have to do thank you notes. You know, we went to every stationery store in Israel and couldn't find thank you notes. We finally go to the biggest Kravitz in Jerusalem, and the stores, I said, we have any thank you notes? Yisraelim lo omrim todah. Israelis don't say thank you. We figured to buy each card at 12 shekels a piece, we'd spend more on the cards than the wedding. In the end, we printed our own. But the energy is ridiculous. Like the cab driver in Israel picks you up, stops and picks someone else up without asking you, and then the whole way you're driving is telling you the answers to all the world's problems, then drops you off at your house, and then asks you what you paid for it. You know, my English wife thinks, what time is it is a personal question. The pushing, the shoving, the energy. I tell my students in Israel, I say, spend a week, a month in Israel, and then go back. Don't try an El Al flight. That's like a little mini version of Israel. We're like 400 Jews for 12 hours in a very small space. Hamish Airlines. But go stand in and it doesn't work well in Queens because there's too many Jews around here. But go stand in like Des Moines, Iowa after being in Israel for a month. You know what you feel? Gentiles. I'm not saying anything bad about non-Jews. My blood pressure goes down like 30 points when I leave Israel. That and not listening to the news for a week is great. But this is the whole point. The energy of the Jewish people is absolutely unbelievable. So if you also look at when people are describing the Jewish personality, what other trait do you often see us accused of being constantly in the Torah? Stiff-necked. Okay? This is the flip side of the drive. And if you know psychology, you know that every one of us has a positive and negative side that are connected. Like for instance, some of you don't know me more than a half hour. How many of you think I'm patient? No one ever raises their hand. My mother certainly never raised her hand on that one. But it's part of my personality. I have a lot of energy, but I have impatience. I have to control the negative and use the positive. It has a very positive side to it. All of us have the same trait personally, but we collectively have the same thing. We have one tremendous drive, but the negative side is the stiff-necked. Is it negative, by the way? Is it all negative? It's actually not. Think about it. What does stiff-necked mean? You know, we have different variations. Stubborn. It makes sense, by the way. To do what Abraham did, you got to be a pretty strong-willed person to stand up to the whole world, you know. But the negative side is what? We are incredibly difficult people to unify because we are so individualistic and opinionated. The Midrash in Shmot Rabbah summed it up beautifully, and it's a great quote because it really gives the spin on it correctly. It says, what is meant by saying that Jews are stiff-necked people? Rav Yakim said there are three who are inherently chutzpahdik. That's really the word that describes the Jewish people. Like, what does chutzpah mean? Like nerve, gumption. Most non-Jews can't even say the word. They can't do the ch, whatever. Someone sent me a cute YouTube video of a Christian evangelical choir singing Jewish songs. What do they start out with? Hava Nagila Venismeka. Anyway, there are three who are inherently chutzpahdik. The dog amongst the animals, the rooster amongst the birds, and the Jews amongst the nations. You might think this is something negative, but it's really praise. It means a Jew would rather be hanged than give up his Judaism. Rabin said to this very day, Jews in diaspora are called stiff-necked. So there's a positive side to the trait. Without this, we would not have lasted as long as we did and impacted the world and outlasted the greatest empires and changed the world in ways that are so profound very few of us appreciate. But what's the negative side of being so stiff-necked? It makes for incredibly fractious people. Jewish humor always reflects this, like the Jew who gets stranded on the desert island, builds two synagogues, one he davens in and one he won't go into. You know, I make that joke, but I remember 12 years ago when the U.S. Army went into Kabul, Afghanistan, the first night of Hanukkah, the CNN reporter goes into the only functioning synagogue in all of Afghanistan. He finds the last two Jews, Simon Tov and Levi, first night of Hanukkah, lighting menorahs on either side of the synagogue and not speaking to each other. It was ridiculous. And even he, the non-Jewish reporter, walks over to Simon Tov, the older one, and says, can't you guys light a menorah together? And the guy says, I'm 70 years old, I've lived through everything, the Russians, the Taliban, the U.S., but that guy Levi, he's evil. It was ridiculous. And we see this, remember the apocryphal story of Golda Meir and Harry Truman, when Harry Truman says to Golda Meir, you have no idea what it's like to be the president of a country of 180 million people. And Golda Meir says, you're right, but you have no idea what it's like to be the prime minister of a country of 1.8 million prime ministers. And it's true, it's easier to be the emperor of 1 billion Chinese than the mayor of a town of 100 Jews. I'm not saying anything bad about Chinese people. And my last little story that illustrates this, when I was doing my tour guides course, I studied with Mayor Pa'il, who's like 96 years old. He's fought in every war since like 1947. He's a funny guy. He says, every army in the world is the same. In every army, the officers give orders, the soldiers salute and do the orders. But he said, in the Israeli army, in the Jewish army, you have to explain things. Which is true. I was in the IDF. It was ridiculous. After basic training, you call your officer by his first name. No one salutes. It's the Hamish army. It's hysterical. Like marching, I used to be a Boy Scout. I used to do marching competitions. My kids have all been in the army. I watched them march. It's pathetic. What, Jews don't know left and right? No, one's saying, you're doing left, I'm going to do right. I'm not going to do left, you're doing left. It doesn't make for great dress parades. It makes for awesomely good soldiers who take the initiative in battle. But this is the trait. But by the way, it also makes for the greatest challenge in Jewish history, because leading the Jewish people, if you know your Jewish history, is the toughest job on the planet Earth. It's a real challenge for us. Well, let me just jump back and run through a little history and then move it to the modernity and what we can learn from all of this. If we go back to the Bible, we take Abraham's drive, we see that the whole story of the book of Genesis, of Bereshit, is basically the story of Abraham creating a family that makes a nation that has a unique value system. And from then on, as Bilam says in the Bible, the famous non-Jewish prophet, right, we're Am Shishkan Levado. We've always been in a category by ourselves, by the way. That Jewish drive has given us a unique mission, and the world on a very deep subconscious level always judges us differently. It's a topic I've been doing a lot. I did it last night in Toronto. It's called The Nation That Dwells Alone. Why does the whole world pick on tiny Israel? But it goes back to the very unique way we operate in this world and our very unique value system, especially in the ancient world. And until today, by the way, we still stand out. Charles Krauthammer, the columnist, said Jews is news. You ever notice when, since good news is no news and only bad news makes news, when a Jew is perceived to do something wrong even when he hasn't? Or when Israel, which is the most moral country in the world, the only democracy in the Middle East with human rights and free press and free speech, everyone goes nuts on Israel and ignores every other country around us that are all totalitarian, Islamic fundamentalist regimes are rapidly becoming so. We notice this stuff, right? This is a unique status we have had throughout our history, a unique drive, and the world has always looked at us differently. Even non-Jews who are not conscious of this recognize that we have this different role to play in the world. But certainly from the birth of Abraham to the birth of Christianity, we existed alone in the world as the only people believing in one God, pushing against the entire world. I love telling my American college students that Judaism is history's most politically incorrect ideology. You guys know politically correct, right? Like, try telling someone in the U.S. university that you're wrong, unless you're Republican, in which case you're wrong all the time. But what was the essential statement the Jews were saying to the world for 2,000 years? You're all wrong. Your fundamental belief system is incorrect, which explains why we've been so popular in human history, especially in the ancient world. We had run-ups with everyone, with the Greeks when they're trying to destroy Judaism in Hanukkah, with the Romans. We struggled against the pagan world for 2,000 years. The way I explain it is like this. We lost the battles, but we won the war. When I say we lost the battles, you see, first of all, how antithetical our worldview was to, pagans. This is Philostratus. And he's writing 1,800 years ago. He says, for the Jews have long been in revolt. This is almost 2,000 years ago. Not only against the Romans, but against humanity. And a race that has made its own life apart and irreconcilable, that cannot share with the rest of mankind in the pleasures of the table, nor join in the libations or prayers or sacrifices, are separate from ourselves by a greater gulf than divides us from Sura or Bactra of the most distant Indies. Remember that book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus? This is how the world looked at the Jews. They're like a different planet. And again, it wasn't just you do your thing, we'll do ours. We butted heads with these people. And we lost big. When I say we lost everything. We rebelled against the Romans more than any other people. They destroyed the temple. They exiled us. We had the Bar Kokhba uprising. So we lost the battles, but irony of ironies, we won the war. What war did we win? Sorry? Well, A, they're gone. And B, we won the ideological war. Paganism, which was so antithetical to Judaism, which the whole rest of the world believed in, certainly in the Western world is completely eradicated, and directly or indirectly, monotheism has become the dominant worldview. It's a tremendous victory. Christianity, Islam are all basically, theologically and historically, in some way offshoots of the Jewish people. And if you've ever seen the presentation I mentioned earlier, World Perfect, about how we civilized the world, I bring down all these great quotes from people like John Adams, second President of the United States, who say, I will insist that the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. And like I always say, if he were running for president, I would definitely vote for him. Or Paul Johnson, famous British historian who wrote that book, The History of the Jews. Anyone read this book? I was recommending this book for years until I wrote a better one. So ask my mother, she'll tell you. He says, certainly the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. To them we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of individual conscience and so personal redemption, of collective conscience and so social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. It is almost beyond our capacity to imagine how the world would have fared had they never emerged. And this impact is all a byproduct of the unique Jewish worldview and the incredible drive of the Jewish people, willing to stick to our ideas despite all the odds, to die for our beliefs, and ultimately to outlast the greatest empires in human history. So we lost the battles, but we won the war. But the problem is, one of the byproducts of losing the war is we lost our country and went into diaspora, which is the Greek word for scattering, which is, by the way, another totally unique aspect of Jewish identity. That we survived as a nation without a national homeland for 2,000 years is unbelievable. I always say the 3 most ubiquitous products on the planet Earth are Jews, McDonald's, and Coca-Cola. You know, some places have Jews, Burger King, and Pepsi, but they all got Jews. We're just spread out everywhere. But it's not a good thing, by the way. We look at it today as normal, but it's very abnormal. And it took a tremendous toll on who we are as a people. Samuel Kalinsky wrote this very interesting book called The Eighth Day. He writes, the dispersion of the Jews was both a boon and a bane, which means it was good and bad. Their nation was disjoined, meaning we're scattered, but their culture was enormously enhanced. We got to travel around the world and pick up other people's cooking, you know? Whereas a unique omniatic outlook, I have not found this word in any dictionary. If anyone ever finds it, I don't know what it means, but omniatic outlook, set the Jews apart from other peoples. I think he's talking about monotheism. A common language, literacy, and learning bound the disparate Jewish communities together and provided a firm foundation for further creativity. The exercise of this multifaceted creative propensity rebounded to benefit not only the societies that harbored the Jews, but all humankind. Of every book I've ever read, this is the book that has more big words in it than any other book. But basically what he's saying is, you know, the diaspora was a good and a bad thing. On one hand, it spread us around. We were subject to persecution, but we got to culturally diversify. But better like that, it's like it says in Navi, God says, I'll scatter the Jews amongst the nations like a farmer scatters seed. So the Jewish drive gets spread around the world and germinates so much creativity in different places, especially the places that tolerated Jews, like Germany pre-Holocaust, which was an incredibly productive society. The world, all the Nobel Prizes in the world were going into Germany pre-Holocaust. It's funny, you look at 1935 Nuremberg laws, complete end. Nothing after that. But then what happened also, as he pointed out, the negative side was being in diaspora, being without our country, exposed us, especially in medieval Europe, up until really the modern period, to ghettos, persecution, expulsion, slaughter. A good percentage of the Jews never made it to modernity, and those that did suffered tremendously in the process. And then, of course, we came to the Enlightenment, and the persecution at least largely ceased into the Holocaust. But then we were subject to what turns out to be in history a greater threat than even physical destruction of the Jewish people, which is the Enlightenment, which along which came emancipation in the 19th century, followed by largely the secularization and assimilation of massive numbers of Jews. Do you guys appreciate that more Jews have disappeared since the Holocaust statistically than Hitler killed in the Holocaust? And this is certainly not a new phenomenon. In periods of time in history, there have been massive waves of Jewish assimilation in the world. So while we definitely helped seed the world, and a Jewish drive, in many ways, besides just monotheism, was a tremendously dynamic force for change in technology and innovation, it took a tremendous toll on the Jewish people. Paul Johnson, in his book, A History of the Jews, he sums up what happened to us very nicely when he says, "For the Jewish impact on humanity has been protean, it's been huge. In antiquity, they were the great innovators of religion and morals. In the Dark Ages and early medieval period, they were still an advanced people transmitting scarce knowledge and technology. Gradually, they were pushed from the van and fell behind. By the end of the 18th century, they were seen as a bedraggled and obscurantist rearguard in the march of civilized humanity." But then, he's talking about with the modern period, the last couple hundred years, came an astonishing second birth of creativity. Breaking out of the ghettos, they once more transformed human thinking, this time in the secular sphere. Much of the mental furniture of the modern world, too, is of Jewish fabrication. And this is like all the Nobel Prizes in technology, and the Freud, and the Einstein, and the Marx, and all that stuff. But as he points out, secular sphere, because almost all these people were no longer connected to Torah, but the drive is a raw force inside them, pushing them to rise to the top, think outside the box, and be disproportionately impactful. The problem is, however, the messenger has largely forgotten the message. We have the drive as this raw force pushing us. It's always there. But like I always say, we're like one giant ADD nation. The vast majority of Jews are driven, but driven to distraction, to things outside of Torah. And today we basically have, like everyone likes to sum up, Jews for every ism but Judaism. And by the way, one of the best ways you can see Jewish drive in action, because think about it, if Abraham's thing is tikkun olam, fix the world, what's the next best thing a Jew can do that's as close as you can get to like bringing the world back to a perfect world via God? Get involved in a cause. And this is an amazing statistic. As amazing, I think more amazing than Nobel Prizes. Take any cause to make the world a better place you could think of. Black civil rights, anti-apartheid, labor movements, feminism, child labor laws, anti-apartheid. It's unbelievable. Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International. Take any cause to make the world a better place. In the last century or more, and I will show you, if it isn't founded by a Jew, it's overwhelmingly disproportionately run by Jews. Because disconnected Jews still have the Jewish drive. They want to impact the world. And they're going to naturally gravitate to anything they think will make the world a better place. What, by the way, think about it, is it says, why is the Torah given to Israel? Because they are aggressive and stubborn. If the Torah had not been given to Israel, no nation or tongue could withstand them. This is the Talmud in Beitzah. If I paraphrase the Talmud, it's basically saying that not only are Jews driven to often do good things, but misguided Jews can be the most destructive force in human history. And we see this, by the way. When a Jew goes off, he does it big, whatever we do. What is the political ideology that was founded by Jews, driven by Jews? Until today, Jews are obsessed with this. First of all, any left-wing political ideology, but specifically communism and socialism. You guys realize that Jews created communism. Moses Hess was really the first communist. He taught it to Karl Marx, a Jew, and Engels, a non-Jew. The whole Russian Revolution, except for Lenin, who all my Jewish friends in Russia told me was Jewish too, but whatever. Trotsky, Zamenev, Kanoviev, Rosa Luxemburg. It's a who's who of Jews. Why are Jews? You guys notice this phenomenon? That Jews are so... I have another presentation. It's called In God We Trust. It's about the impact of Judaism on modern political thinking and why Jews vote the way they do. And it deals specifically with this issue of the obsession Jews have with liberal and extreme left-wing ideologies. And you know who saw this best? The literary critic Edmund Wilson. This is an amazing quote. Edmund Wilson writes, and he wrote this in like the 1950s, "The Jew lends himself easily to communism because it enables him to devote himself to a high cause involving all of humanity, characteristics which are natural to him as a Jew." Do you see how well he understands the Jewish personality? High cause involving all of humanity. And by the way, left-wing progressive movements, of which communism, socialism are all left-wing progressive, top-down, anything that is top-down, replacing God with government to solve problems will always disproportionately attract Jews, which explains why what percent of Jews in America, by the way, classify themselves as liberal? What percentage of... What do you think? In America, not you guys. 73%. What percentage of Americans classify themselves as liberal? The whole population. 28%. It's unbelievable. But this is the explanation. We love anything to fix the world. And by the way, when Jews go off, they go off big. Like, or biggest stock market scandals, Michael Milken, Ivan Boesky, that kind of stuff. Remember Bernie Madoff? $65 billion Ponzi scam. Organized crime. My titles disappear, but that's Bugsy Siegel. That's Meyer Lansky. Jacob Greasy Spoon Guzik. How's that for a nickname? Like, what do you think? Crime got organized by Italians? Only when Lucky Luciano meets up with Meyer Lansky over there, this guy, that's when crime gets organized. And only Jews would have a crime syndicate with Bugsy Siegel in it called Murder Incorporated so they could write the bullets off as a tax deduction. But the drive is a neutral force. It can push us into extremely destructive things like the Talmud and Beitzah was saying. But it's going to push us. Whatever we do, we're going to do really, really big. So the reality is, and we're coming to the end here, we see that this Jewish drive is a reality. Everyone sees it. It manifests itself in every form possible in the Jewish personality, in every environment possible, at every period of time in Jewish history. And by the way, what's also interesting is that, Churchill pointed this out too. That he said some people like the Jews and some do not. But no thoughtful man can deny that the fact that they are beyond any question the most formidable and the most remarkable race which has appeared in the world. And he liked us. But what's most interesting, guys, is sometimes the people who dislike us the most understand us the best. Look at this Hitler quote. It is quite scary how well Hitler appreciates who the Jews are. He says, if only one country for whatever reason tolerates a Jewish family in it, that family will become the germ center. The Belsenhard is a basilicus, bacteria, for fresh sedition. If one little Jewish boy survives without any Jewish education, with no synagogue and no Hebrew school, it's in his soul. Even if there had never been a synagogue or a Jewish school of the Old Testament, the Jewish spirit would still exist and exert its influence. It has been there from the beginning, and there is no Jew, not a single one, who does not personify it. Do you guys appreciate that Hitler gets it? By the way, he understands Jews better than 90% of the Jews in the world understand Jews. Adolf Hitler is not evil because of his understanding of the Jewish people. He's evil because of his reaction to it. He says, I see the power of the Jew as an unstoppable force in history, and it's not enough to just burn down the synagogues, Chas v'shalom, and destroy yeshivas. Every Jew is going to be this little powerhouse like Abraham to change the world, and since Hitler was ultimately a strongly ideologically motivated person, he knew that his greatest enemy, not on a physical level, but on an ideological level, ultimately making it his greatest enemy, were the Jewish people. It's very powerful that someone like Hitler sees who we are so strongly. The way I sum it up is basically, I love to use the analogy of the Jewish people as a rocket. Okay, and a rocket is a neutral device. It can do very positive things like send a man to the moon or launch a communication satellite. It can also deliver an intercontinental ballistic missile. He says, and we Jews are really a rocket. We have this incredible drive. It can do tremendous great things in this world. It can do tremendous evil things in this world. The question is, what will Jewish drive be used for? What Abraham wanted to be used for, or the opposite? To create destructive political movements and causes that are antithetical movements to Judaism, or to finish the job that Abraham started thousands of years ago? A rocket needs two things. It needs fuel to keep itself going, and it needs a guidance system. Okay, without those two things, it's not going to get very far, and it's not going to end up in the right direction. We Jews, if we're a rocket, we need the same two things. And what's interesting is Rashi, when commenting on that statement in the Talmud about how destructive Jews can be, he says, the Torah was given to the Jews because they are overly aggressive, and the Torah serves to moderate their energy and to subdue their heart. Like I say, like Torah, Lahavda, is like Prozac for the Jewish soul. It calms us down and it directs us. It gives us the direction we need to use that incredible drive and put it in the right direction. This is why it's a great topic for Shavuos. We have to understand why the Torah is so important. God puts us into Egypt to form us into a nation. And I always explain this to my students. It's amazing how secular Jews all think Passover is the holiday for just freedom, because everything in America is about freedom, right? And I explain, no, God put us in there to take us out, not to just give us a credit card and tell us to go shopping in Costco, to bring us to Mount Sinai, to give us the software package, to enable us to use that incredible drive that we collectively came from Abraham and got in the right direction. And the most beautiful way it's said is the Torah is like oil in a lamp, and Israel is its wick, causing the light of God to shine forth on all creation. That's the Tikkuni Zohar. It's a beautiful way of putting it. And if you look at who we are as a people, and you see that our drive is a reality, we understand what pushes us, and everyone sees this. And we understand that we have such great potential, then our guidance system and our fuel are one and the same thing. It's the Torah. Okay, that's what it's all about. A Jew without Torah, and I always say this to my students, I say, and this is a big lesson I give parents who are not religious. I say, unless you connect part of your soul to Yiddishkeit and to Torah, you're always going to feel absent. And unless you teach your kids, they're also going to be empty. You'll try and fill it with all kinds of false meaning. You'll buy a bigger house and bigger car and look for more recognition and more awards. Not that you can't be a doctor or a lawyer, I tell them. Not that you can't win like a Nobel Prize. Not that you can't get gold in the Olympics. Not too likely if you're Jewish. I always say, what's the sign of maturity in a Jewish boy when he recognizes statistically has a far greater chance of owning a professional sports team than actually playing on one? But I said, unless you connect your Jewish soul to Torah, your potential is going to be largely wasted, and you're always going to feel empty. Something's going to be missing, because this is our rocket fuel, this is our guidance system. And just to close, and this is sort of my pitch I give to, like, usually my not-so-affiliated Jewish audience, the number one thing if we take from this is, if this is true, that this is what drives us, then we have to be connected to learning. And what we're doing, even if we're not full-time yeshiva students, we have to find time in our day, every day, to be learning Torah, because you can't represent the Jewish people till you know what the Jewish people represents. Ignorance and not anti-Semitism has always been the greatest threat to us. But the other thing we have to appreciate is this drive makes us tremendously individualistic, and it also explains we're such a fractious people. We have to really learn to start to get along and focus on, this is my pet peeve, I'm even launching a website soon called Junite.org. Because we spend far too much time focusing on what disunites us and what separates us than what unites us. We have to appreciate the Jewish people. We're like a family. And a family is an interesting thing. You have friends and you have family. We all appreciate if you treated your friends as if they were family, you wouldn't have any friends. Right? Family forgives you. You don't have to be so big on the manners with family. If you don't say, please pass the salt, you'll get it anyway. But what's the difference between friends and family? A lot of your friends are fair weather friends. Family's always there for you. That's the Jewish people. It explains why, on one hand, we tend to be a little brusque with each other, especially when we live together in a place like Israel, and maybe sometimes in Queens and Brooklyn. But it also explains that just like family, if we focused on our family, then we have to look at our fellow Jews, brothers and sisters, regardless of whether or not they're holding in the same place. And guys, this is a huge point. We're living in a very difficult and dangerous period of time, and we're fighting amongst each other while there's a lot of people out there who want to get rid of us. Now more than ever, we have to focus on this Jewish unity, and we have to look inside our fellow Jew and recognize this is my brother or my sister. They have the same soul drive as I do. They may have a little bit different way of getting there. I may not agree with everything they say, but they've got that beautiful soul that we got for Abraham and Sarah, just like I have. They want to impact the world, and I have to learn to at least respect what they're saying if I don't agree with it, and at least get along with them, and more importantly, to try and work together with my fellow Jews to focus that incredible energy that we have that so changed the world, to bring that beautiful mission that we started thousands of years ago into reality. And I'd just like to end with a quote from the British historian Cecil Roth, who's no longer with us. One of the few Jewish historians who's actually traditional. Most of them are totally not religious. But he summed it up, and he leaves us with sort of a challenge, which I think is the thought we should take away from us when we finish this talk. Although this audience, of course, is somewhat more connected than the normal audience, I think what he's saying is essentially very important. He says, our survey of 3.5 millennia of Jewish history is closed, but the story which we have set ourselves to telling is unending. Today, the Jewish people has in it still those elements of strength and endurance which enabled it to surmount all the crises of its past, surviving thus the most powerful empires of antiquity. Throughout our history, there have been weaker elements who have shirked the sacrifices which Judaism entailed. They have been swallowed long since in the great majority. Only the more stalwart have carried on the traditions of their ancestors and can now look back with pride upon their superb heritage. Are we to be numbered with the weak majority or with the stalwart minority? It is for ourselves to decide. Thank you very much.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.